Tony because of his New York Times essay called "A Policy Renaissance is Needed for Rural America to Thrive." He is a senior fellow in the Center for Sustainable Development at the Brookings Institution. His current work includes leading the Reimagining Rural Policy Initiative and the Local Leadership on Sustainable Development Goals Initiative, which is where we got the inspiration for our theme. His background addressing poverty and advancing inclusive economic development influences the ideas he will be sharing. What I love about this panel is that we'll be able to hear firsthand stories from folks doing the great work on the ground. Tony, over to you, and thank you.
Thanks, Juliana, and thanks for the invitation to be here today. That really was lovely music and really set the stage. Another round of applause for that. So as Juliana mentioned, I'm the host of a podcast called Reimagining Rural. I'm going to give a little bit of context for why I started that podcast, but I'm joined here today by Gloria Dickerson and Alex Beck, who both joined me in different episodes on the podcast. We had hoped actually to be also joined by Lakota Vogel from Eagle Butte, South Dakota. Unfortunately, her grandmother passed away, and as the spirit of communities, she felt it was really important to be with her family at this time. But I know she would have been excited to join this conversation. To give you a sense of what the reason was for the podcast and why we decided to get into storytelling on the podcast, as Juliana says, I run an initiative focused on kind of reforming and modernizing federal rural policy. And so this is a piece of work that follows me everywhere. This is kind of the capital market of resources coming from the federal government to be able to be available for community economic development in rural places. And as you can see, it's a fairly confusing landscape. On your left are all the places within the federal government from where money might emanate to be able to support development. On the right, that right-hand column, is legislation that created those programs. And in the middle are the kinds of objectives that those programs are trying to achieve, whether it be economic development or improvements in health, education, supporting businesses, supporting the arts. And from my perspective, it doesn't really reflect a coherent vision. And I don't think that there's even a vision behind it of how rural places can thrive in the 21st century. I don't think it recognizes about a quarter of these programs are specific to rural defined many different ways in the federal government. And about 3/4 of these programs, rural places would be, vying for those resources with other communities. But I think there's unique characteristics in rural communities, characteristics around capacity, characteristics around identity, and how change happens, which I don't think there's a vision from policymakers in Washington, D.C. of how that really can happen in the 21st century. And so we set out to reimagine rural policy, and I felt as if we needed to tell policymakers the story of rural, to hear from people who are creating change in their own communities, how that change happens, and in very practical terms, understand the unique characteristics of what it means to live and thrive in rural communities. And so the primary audience for the podcast really is policymakers and decision makers, funders, state government officials, as well as congressional members and congressional staff. The major secondary audience, honestly, is the major media, because I feel like they also have their own preconceptions of what's happening in rural America. And we really wanted to show the diversity of rural and show how rural is a place of opportunity, to push against this narrative of rural being a place in decline or almost even potentially obsolete. And underneath all of this is an exploration of where policy intersects with that, and how policy could more effectively be actually supporting the kind of change that's happening in rural communities across the country. So I visited a bunch of different places. I have two of the people here with me today who I visited with. I want to have them give a little bit of their own perspective and tell the story of their own work and their towns, and just sort of draw out some of the themes of where things are different and where things are similar. So Gloria, let me start with you. You're in Drew, Mississippi. So describe for the audience the place that you come from. Describe a little bit about Drew. How large is it? Who lives there? What happens there? And a little bit about your own personal history with that place.
Hope my mic is on?
Yep,
yes,
it's working.
Is. Okay. I am from Drew, Mississippi. I was born and raised there. Drew, Mississippi is in the Mississippi Delta. And it's about 2,000 people who live there. It's 85% African American. And a lot of the people there are from low income, are living in poverty. It's a place that has an opportunities there in terms of improving the things that go on there and what the people do there to live and to thrive. I grew up there as a child of sharecroppers. My parents were sharecroppers, and we were living in poverty at the time that I lived there. We actually wanted change so much in that community that my family decided to integrate the schools in 1965, and we went to an all-white school, and we were the only family who did that. In 1955, Drew is also the place where Emmett Till was lynched, so it's kind of a dangerous place full of racism and inequities. And so that's the place that I grew up in. I left there, but I also came back there, and I'm glad to be back there.
And we'll talk a little bit about your return. But just to put a point on it, you literally desegregated the schools in Drew, Mississippi. You and your siblings were the first ones to go to that all-white school.
We were, and it was 7 of us, and we were the only 7 that decided to do that. Everybody else was in the community was so full with fear that they wouldn't dare try to integrate a school. But we did it because my mom was so interested in us having some more better opportunities than what she had and the way she had grown up. And so she wanted opportunities for her children.
All right, thank you. Alex, let me turn to you. Same question. You're in Brattleboro, Vermont, not too far from here, actually. So describe for us a little bit about Brattleboro and also your history with that place.
Yeah, thanks. So for those of you who are from Keene, don't need to say much about Brattleboro, but for those who are visiting, Brattleboro is half the size of Keene in terms of population, and our county that our organization operates in is about half the size of Cheshire County. So it's smaller, not as rural as Drew, around 12,000 people. I came initially as an SIT Graduate Institute student. My background's in environmental science and international studies, and I could have sworn I'd be doing rural sustainable development abroad. But like many SIT students, I got stuck in Brattleboro. And I think in a little bit I'll talk about why we want people to get stuck in our rural communities if they're the kind of people we know we want and need there. So that's what brought me here and kept me here.
So 2 very different places, different ends of the country. And when I went to visit Lakota, actually, in Eagle Butte, South Dakota, I tell the story. I'm from north central Pennsylvania, a town of about 2,000, an hour and a half northeast of Harrisburg, which is the state capital. And when I went to visit Lakota in South Dakota, I also flew into the state capital and drove about an hour and a half to Eagle Butte. But what's very interesting, and to just showcase this diversity, is when I drive from Harrisburg to where I grew up in north central Pennsylvania, I drove through a lot of small towns, or you can see lots of small towns. Towns of about 2,000 to 10,000 people, But you see a lot of that on the hour-and-a-half drive. When I flew into Pear, South Dakota, and then drove to Eagle Butte, I definitely saw a lot more cows than people. And it just, that feeling of remoteness becomes very stark. And so I think one thing we need to keep in mind when we're talking about policy is how different and diverse rural is, geographically, economically, and also racially, and creating policy that can support many different kinds of communities. But let's continue with the story. And Gloria, you talked about, you left Drew, Mississippi, and came back. So in some respects, you're rural by choice. Talk a little bit about that personal trajectory. What did you go off and do when you left Drew? And then why come back to Drew?
I went off and I went to college, which was a blessing because we were able to graduate from high school and then go off to college and have a good career. I moved to Jackson, Mississippi, which is a larger place than Drew, and it was like, you know, a new world for me. And I worked there, and then I went to Battle Creek, Michigan, and I worked there. And I got into philanthropy and worked at the Kellogg Foundation. And that was an eye-opener for me also. Because there I found out that there are places out there are people out there who are really trying to help and are really funding rural areas, and they want to help the rural areas. But I also thought about the fact that I was hearing in that world of philanthropy that the people in the Mississippi Delta, they were going to try to give up on them because they thought things would never change there. And they kept saying, as long as they're thinking the way that they're thinking, we don't know whether we should try to continue to invest in these small rural places like Drew, Mississippi. That bothered me because I knew that that was not necessarily true, that the people did want for stuff in Drew, Mississippi. And so when I retired from the foundation, I decided that I wanted to go back and make sure that there wasn't a forgotten places, that we weren't forgetting people. And I was passionate about that because when I lived there, I was hoping that we wouldn't be forgotten there, that people would really understand that we were still out there, and that we were people and that we wanted things. So I went back there, and I knew that when I got back there, I saw some things that I really didn't like. I saw some things, I'd been in another world where I saw all kinds of wonderful, great things going on in terms of income levels and wealth and educational levels and academic levels. And I learned a lot while I was away from the community. And I wanted to take that knowledge back to the community and help the people who still live there. And I grew up, it was a painful growing up there, very painful for me. And I realized that some of those people were still living the pain, and I wanted to go back to help and say, you don't have to live the pain. So that's what took me back to Drew, Mississippi. And I enjoy what I do. I love it. And I enjoy, helping people move from poverty to prosperity. That was started the organization, We Together Creating Change. And our mission is to transform low-income communities in the Mississippi Delta to places of prosperity, places of opportunities, places of hope. And one of the things that was being said is that the people have given up hope. And a lot of the people had given up hope. And so my mission is to you often hear people say that hope is not a strategy, but without hope, there is no strategy. So you have to get to the hope first, and then you can start talking about strategies, and let's do something, and let's create something new, and let's get excited about what we can do. And in that spirit, that's what I wanted to create in that particular community, because it's my community. My grandparents lived there, my parents lived there. They walked that land when it was really a terrible place to be. My grandfather was an enslaved person. So I knew that there was some hope because I had come so far from where my grandfather was.
So just talk a little bit, just to stay on that. How do you then, through the work that you've been doing through We Together Creating Change, how did you start to sort of ignite that spark of hope and grow it a little bit. Talk about some of the things that you started out doing.
I started out working with the young people, and I went to the school district and worked with the young people, and I went there to encourage them, and mostly I went there to listen to them. I wanted to hear what were the young people talking about these days, what kinds of things that they want. And they started telling me about the things that they wanted, which sounded a lot like the things I wanted when I was growing up. They saying that we want our schools to be good schools, we want some books, we don't have books in our schools, we want to be able to use some technology, we want to be prepared when we get ready to go to college. All those things that they were saying, and they were saying, can you help us? Because we do want to thrive, and we do want a career, and we do want these things. So I found out from the young people that this is what they wanted, and they said also, maybe you should talk to our parents as well, because we think that our parents need more support than what they're getting, and we're not really talking to each other. The school district and the community is not really talking to each other, listening to each other. So I tried to make arrangements so that we would start to communicate with each other and talk with each other and have meetings with each other and just really listen not only to the adults but also listen to the children.
And then that grew into almost a collaborative, actually, of different organizations coming together, yeah?
Yes. What happened was we started to talk and have meetings, and the community would come to the meetings. And in the beginning, the community would talk about what we don't have, what we don't like. And so I said, okay, let's all vent and get that out, put it on the flip chart like we usually do in meetings, and put that on the board. So now that we got all that written down, all that's on the board, let's change the narrative some. Let's talk about something different. Let's talk about what it is that we want to create. And anytime we started to hear the people talk about what we don't have, we say, okay, that's already on the board. Let's talk about what we want to create in this community. And so in the beginning, the community was kind of skeptical because they kept saying things have always been this way. Who's going to help us? We don't have the resources to do the things that we want. So I said, just name the things that you want. And so they started, well, we would love to have a grocery store. I mean, that's basic, isn't it? We can't buy an apple or orange or banana in this community, so we need access to food. And then they talked about the recreation for their children. We want our children to be able to have a playground and go outside and play. We like to be able to walk around our community using sidewalks and things like that. We like to enjoy what we see when we go outside. We'd like our community to be cleaned up and a lot of the dilapidated houses and the blight taken out of our community. And then we like some more affordable housing because we don't have good affordable housing. And so it was like, how can we get all that with no resources? And so what we decided to do is, okay, we've named what we wanted, and we know that we need some help. We admitted that we didn't have everything that we needed to make that happen. So I said, why don't we invite some other people in to help us? And that's what we did. We formed a Drew Collaborative, and we invited someone to come be with our group that knew a lot about housing. We invited someone to come in to talk about financing and credit. We invited the economic development person to come in from the county. We invited some business person to come in and sit with us and go over all these things. And we never lost sight, though, that the community voice was the most important thing in the room, and that the community voice would be heard even though the other people were coming in. And so that's where we started the Drew Collaborative, and we got together and did our strategic plan. And we named the things that we wanted, and then we said, okay, now we're gonna figure out how we get there with all the help that has come in to help us.
All right, thank you. And that collaborative is, just to cut to that collaborative, that grocery store that you talked about, they weren't able to bring in a grocery store, but you redid the armory and created an online way for people to order groceries, bring those groceries to the armory so they could have fresh food, and it would be it would be accessible. So Alex, we just heard a lot of that sense of hope, then turning to what is it we do want, and that idea of collaboration.
Yeah, I wrote that all down. I was taking notes.
Okay.
And you know, you've been involved in a lot of collaboration in Brattleboro, but talk to me a little bit about what was the issue that you were trying to solve, and then how did you go about thinking about how to solve it, and the collaboration that was necessary to do that?
So I'm going to steal it right here and say we stopped focusing on what we didn't have, which was people. So if you're familiar with rural New England, it's all about population loss, and Vermont has struggles with that as many other places. And instead of focusing on, well, who's leaving, what are we missing, who's not here, we focused on, well, who do we want here? What does a vibrant, diverse, thriving community look like, and how do we build that? And so many years, not many years, but a handful of years before I joined the organization, they did the strategic planning, our comprehensive economic development strategies. For the last 15 years, population was the #1 threat, not only to our economy, but to our community institutions. Pretty much everything that we need relies on people to support it. And so that was really the North Star and for our work. And so we focused first on supporting youth. So we did a lot of, and still do, high school career awareness, creating that stickiness with our young people. Do they see the assets that our community can provide them, both economically and not? And then again, looking at what we were missing and why are there, and what we ended up focusing on, and what my role is now, is welcoming new Vermonters, refugees, immigrants, folks of diverse backgrounds, because there are far more outwardly xenophobic places in our country that have a lot more immigration. And so our job was to look at all the numbers and to do our economic development thing and say, well, why? Why does Southern Vermont not have a lot of immigration? And so that is how my role was created, and really evolved into focusing on not just who's here now, not just who we're missing, but who we want, and really look at the community that we want to build.
So what did it take to bring those people into your community and welcome them into your community? Talk a little bit about how that's transpired.
Yeah, so for one, we are lucky to be part of the Boston Federal Reserve Working Communities Challenge. And that's a New England-wide initiative. Ours is, of course, for Vermont. And we had the opportunity to really ask that question at a systems level. I was cold calling refugee resettlement organizations in New England, saying, how do you do it? What do you do? And first and foremost, like, what a weird thing for an economic development person for their job to be. I mean, it is, to my knowledge, one of the only folks who has been supported like that. So kudos to our organization for allowing me to just call these folks and ask. And so we met the Ethiopian Community Development Council, which is one of the 9 or 10 national refugee resettlement organizations. And so we had done planning. We had been thinking about this since 2015, since the Syrian refugee crisis. Of course, in 2016, refugee resettlement stopped because of our federal government. And so I'm doing this research, and I talk to these folks. I'm like, do you have time the next month or two to talk about how you do it? And they said, how about next week? Because we really want to open up a new site in Vermont. You've done the work, you've done the planning, you've built your coalition of folks that's part of that Working Communities initiative. So a lot of the thought and preparation met opportunity. And so in July, our organizations helped submit the application to the federal government to open the office. It was approved. We were told 1 or 2 families a month, probably, for the first year, and then Kabul fell. And so that quickly turned into, I believe we're up to 200 folks by the end of this year, with 120 individuals coming in the first 3 months of 2021. So when we're talking about population decline or growth, we added an entire population, a percentage point to the population of Brattleboro in 3 months. And we've already seen all the benefits of that, which I can get to later.
Well, talk a little bit about what it took in terms of the work with the churches, employers, everybody else to actually really be welcoming.
Yeah, I mean, and I think I will say the labor shortage has done wonders, because our employers will do anything for labor, and they'll support folks in the workplace in ways we never expected. You know, your family-owned lumberyard, you know, the good old boys saying, do these guys need prayer space so that they can show up to work and be present and not worry about feeling unwelcomed? Co-workers who have never worked next to an immigrant, let alone a refugee, let alone someone from such a different culture, driving people to and from work. The employer side of things has been a lot of preparation, but that's been really smooth going, generally speaking. And similarly with community groups, we are a community who has strong values of welcomeness. And what I think is that our little back-end work of ensuring the infrastructure was in place allowed our community to live into its values. So we had all of these community and religious groups they wanted to do something really meaningful and impactful, and there wasn't a thing quite there yet. And so when we put out an all call, we need volunteers, we need sponsors for these families to make sure that even after the 90 days, when they're no longer in the formal refugee resettlement program, who's looking out for these folks? Who's making sure these folks feel like Vermonters and are welcomed as Vermonters? And so it's not easy to do, but in terms of how our community stepped up, is frankly the best part of my job doing this work.
All right. Well, thanks for both of you for laying that out. And Gloria, let me turn back to you. I know that through the work you've been doing with We Together Creating Change and the Drew Collaborative, y'all have done the online grocery. You've been taking care of a lot of dilapidated houses, you fixed up the park and created a pavilion, community gathering space. So you've been able to start to leverage those resources. You start to get investment in. You start to create that opportunity and that hope that you talked about. What have been some of the barriers to accessing those resources, either from state government or the federal government? And what are some of the challenges that you faced head on?
Well, there have been some barriers to accessing the resources. I've been working, We Together Creating Change works closely with the city, and I'm also a county, with y'all, county commissioner as well. But because of the income levels of the people who live in the community, the tax base is not there to support the community. And so what we've seen is a lot of deterioration because the city just barely had enough money to operate. So we were dependent on hoping that we could get some funding from philanthropy, from the government, and from different places like that. And one of the things that's a barrier was the city was behind on their audits, probably about 5 or 6 years, because they just didn't have the money. They took care of their salaries. They tried to provide safety for people in the community. The police force and all that had to be taken care of. So that was one thing that was falling behind, was having to do their audits. And so when you don't have audits, you can't get money. And so, and so we would go to different places and say, We Together would say, we need money to help the city get their audits. And the answer was mostly, well, we don't fund that. So how are you going to ever get anything? You can't get money to get your audit. And so that was a barrier there. And then also, even for the nonprofits, when I first got into business, you had to have 5 years of audits before you could get money from the federal government. It's like 5 years of audits. I hadn't been in business but 2. And so I'm trying to help, and I got to wait 5 years before I can even be eligible as a new nonprofit to get money, to do things like that. So, and then when the city does get an opportunity to apply for grants, they were skeptical about doing that because they have to have a match. And if you don't have any money, you don't have any money to match. You're asking for money. And so that's something that we've been working on. How are we supposed to match $200,000 with 50% of that when we don't have any money to match? So that's a problem also as far as getting those type of resources. Now, the resources that we were able to get mostly came from people doing, like the organizations came in free of charge. They didn't try to, they were part of the collaborative, so we were all working together. But just getting other resources from the government or even from philanthropy is the most difficult part of all.
Yeah, that point about the match. So every place I went for the podcast, I heard about match requirements and about the barriers that can immediately create in less densely populated places. But Alex, let me ask you the same question. You're trying to bring in and sort of grow your population base. Immigration is a hot topic and a hot issue just in our national politics. What kind of policy barriers did you encounter in the work that you all are doing?
So I think there's national federal immigration policy is just bad, and it's something that if it was my job to work on, I wouldn't care to do this job anymore, because who knows when that will change and how frequently. What really was a challenge is Vermont state law that was just not inclusive due to who is writing our laws. So our education funding for our state college system not being available for people who haven't been here for a year. That's to keep all of those New Hampshire ne'er-do-wells from crossing the river and going to our schools, which, by the way, if we don't have more students, we'll shut down. So please cross the river, go to our schools, please. But the people designing some of these policies, they're designing for the people who are already here, and Vermont is one of the whitest and oldest states in the country. And so we have a lot of silly little policies that I think prove why the Vermont exceptionalism is good until it isn't. Because there's a lot of things like how English language learning is funded and structured. We could look at, by the nature of our population, any other state in the country to look at how they do it, and they probably do it better because they are used to serving an immigrant population. And so, when we go to make change, we'll call the Office of Refugee Resettlement and say, hey, nurses in Florida, which, by the way, we all know how Florida's political leadership feels about immigrants, still their community college system has ELL. And even their people who want to enter high opportunity careers like nursing can take some of their exams in their native language, or they have language accommodations. So simple things like that are widely practiced in other parts of the country, they're new to Vermont. And for a community that doesn't like change, that's been a big challenge. And so the other thing, a lot of new people, what do you all think our biggest challenge is? Yes, yeah, housing. And I think that regardless of what side of the aisle you are on politically, we are unified in New England as like NIMBYers, unfortunately. And so, background in environmental science, so I understand, but if we want more housing, we may need to cut down a tree or two. We may need to rethink of, I know I'm being frank, and we need to think about who we're excluding in our land use policies. And when people talk about the character of New England and the history of New England, no matter where they fall politically or who they're friends with, that is an inherently xenophobic and at times racist sentiment. And so challenging that in constructive ways is something that we can do, because, again, on day 91, our refugees are actually working class Vermonters. And so if we build the infrastructure to make a community that's upwardly mobile for people who need to work, need to afford childcare and housing and transportation, that tends to be our bread and butter focus now, other than the English language learning.
Wonderful, yeah. So we're coming up on time, but Gloria, I want to ask you one last question, because when we talked down in Drew, and I asked you kind of like, what's your economic strategy? You kind of looked at me and said, you know, I'm trying to make sure that we've got beauty here, that we are reinforcing the sense of community and identity, that who we are at Drew. And it's interesting because when you said that, you know, it is something that I heard from a lot of people when I went into rural communities in the podcast. And rather than big economic plans, people felt like they were really important. It was really important in their communities to make things beautiful, to ensure that quality of life was high, and that provided the basis for other things to happen, for that opportunity, whether it be economic or social, to happen. So just talk to me a little bit about kind of beauty as a development strategy. Why is it something that you're just focused on in your town?
Well, I'm focused on beauty because, to me, the people in the community, when I first moved back to the community, was mostly inside of their homes, inside of their houses. There was not much outdoor to do. And also the children in the community complained a lot about the sites that they had to look at on their way to school. And mostly everything in the community had the look of poverty. And so when you have the look of poverty, then people think that's the norm. And that, this is the way life is. And so what we wanted to do was to beautify the community so the community could become more and more proud of their community. And once they're proud of their community, they come together as volunteers to make it look even more better. And that's one of the ways that we did get a lot of our people to come together. We started focusing on what do we look like, and what do we want our community to feel like and look like, and the quality of the things around us. And so they would come out and volunteer and start to clean up and start to plant flowers and shrubbery and just really make it beautiful. And the children appreciated it because the children said, we live in this community and we have to walk to school every day. And when we walk into school, from all the dilapidated homes and stuff, we can see like rats and snakes coming out. And they didn't like that. And I said, well, we need to clean it up first of all, to let people know that we are making progress. Because a lot of times when people go into communities, and I didn't go in because that's my home, they go in with the big plans, and we're going to do this, and we're going to do that, and it never really happens because they can't really get the people involved in it. But once you get people start to say, this is my community, I want it to look beautiful, I want it to look nice, I want there to be some opportunities here, and I believe that if we can do that, then people will look around at us and say, this is a really nice community. I think I may want to put a business here. I may want to build a house in this community just to build up that tax base and bring in other people who never thought this town could look so great. So to me, just the appearance makes a lot of difference to me when you go to a place. We'll have people coming in for economic development, and they look at the place and they're saying, no, this is not somewhere I want to raise my children. And so we want to be the first impression when they drive into our community, say, what a nice, wonderful looking community this is. We see all the things that the people have to work together to get these things done. They must have a lot of volunteers. They must have their people working together, and we want to be a part of that. So that's why I thought, if we can do that part, then we could attract others to our community and bring more opportunities into our community.
And I think that sense of identity, that sense of community, and that sense of focus on beauty and quality of life is a theme that I hear often from small towns and rural communities. And frankly, it's a big mismatch between that big chart we had up beforehand, which is very much focused on sometimes just kind of what I would call things. They're very, very much about the widgets rather than the sense of community and people coming together and working together to bring their community together and for their community's unique identity to really come and flourish. And Alex, just a final word from you before we...
Yeah, so I mean, again, I mentioned for at least 10 years, we've believed as an organization and put it front and center that more people will lead to economic and community vibrancy. And to be frank, until we did this work, I couldn't have told you it was the truth. But just came from a conference where economic development organizations are putting up murals and doing all of this community work. Just by welcoming new and more people into our community, we've got 2 different murals. We've got businesses opening. You know, the job stuff is great. You know, manufacturers are going crazy. Everyone's happy. Everyone, you know, we got folks who don't speak any English making $35 an hour. So economically, we knew that would happen. But we've got volunteers on our boards. We've got more kids in our schools. Now, I grew up near Boston. If I send my kid to public school, it will look closer to the kind of classroom that I grew up in terms of where people are coming from. And so it just proved, I think, that we were a little right, that if you're really intentional about who and how you're welcoming folks in, that's enough to really create some community and economic vibrancy.
And help shape what the new identity of the community is in a very diverse way. So I want to thank both of you for sharing your stories here with us today and for sharing your stories on the podcast. We want to get everybody to the sessions that they're eager to really dive in and think about their own community. But I do think that that was at the heart of what one of the major themes is coming through the podcast, which is there's a lot of diversity, but the shared sense of community, of identity, of the beauty that brings to a place is really important in the communities that we call home. And what we really need is our policies, both at the state and federal level, to be reinforcing that and supporting that, and using that as the starting point, rather than kind of the economic mechanisms that we might think are the things that will support. So thanks very much, and look forward to continuing this conversation throughout the next 2 days. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely the perfect way to kick off 2 days of Reimagining Rural together. You'll find these reflection cards at all of your venues, including out there in the lobby. If you'd like to fill these out at any point during the summit, there's baskets at the venues that you can drop these into. We also have a display as you come in, a wire rack with clothespins. You can put them on there. And basically, it just asks the question, how did this session change your thinking or move you toward action? And we'd love to hear your thoughts, including about this morning's session. Keep an eye on your agenda for activities that take place in between sessions, lunch, in the morning time tomorrow morning. And I can't wait for the next 2 days with you. So I know we're a little over time. There's still plenty of time to walk to your venues and get settled. The track leaders are aware. I'm personally going to be walking to the Historical Society if anyone wants to follow me. That's probably the longest distance. And again, thank you to our panel. Thank you to our poet. Thank you to our musicians. To everyone who participated today, much gratitude. And we will see you momentarily. Have a great day.